Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to cover the media and its relationship to politics. To begin, I have a question for you. How do you get your news? Many times students will share with me that they will receive news from either the internet, from their phone app, from Google News, or from watching TV. But by and large, many Americans around the country get their news from a variety of sources. Take, for example, a growing number is that 44% of Americans, according to Pew Research Center, get their news from Facebook on articles that are shared and distributed amongst your social network of friends. But even though the internet sources have been increasing over the past few decades, one thing to note is that television is the most dominant way Americans get their news. This can either come in the form of local TV broadcasts or national television broadcasts as well. Newspapers have seen a slow and steady decline ever since the invention of the internet. So we see the internet taking that slot from newspapers. And radio, thanks to commuter culture, especially in places like California, radio has also remained relatively stable compared to the newspaper. Now, I want to bring a quote from James Madison into the discussion. He has a famous quote. He says, "A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy or perhaps both." So what Madison is trying to say here is that if we are going to live in a democracy in which the people, the citizens, are going to be asked to vote and weigh in on their opinions on the issues, the people also need to have credible, popular, verifiable information. And if they don't have good information, Madison argues that it is but a prologue to a farce, meaning comedy, a tragedy, or perhaps even a combination of both. We in a democracy do rely on the many media organizations to deliver that popular information. Could you imagine if the press were censored? If all information had to be approved by the government before release? This would be a challenge for many Americans, but it is prevalent around the world. Nonetheless, the American free press, as protected by the First Amendment, has led to historic developments. We can go back to an early era, the colonial period, and see that media was once something distributed by paper. And we see the printing press being very responsible for generating support for massive change, such as the arguments for democracy and the overthrow of the British government. We can also see the history of media unfold when we think about newspapers. Newspapers really began to emerge in the early 19th century. That's the early 1800s. And still, newspaper organizations, whether they are in print or online, they still do exist to this day. This is a famous picture of President Truman. This is on his election night, in which he's holding up an erroneous paper published by the Chicago Daily Tribune. It says, "Dewey, John Dewey, his opponent, defeats Truman." But we know that's not the case. There was no President Dewey. But why is he holding this picture? Well, to be clear, politicians have liked to poke fun at the media for centuries. Politicians seek out favorable press, and they struggle to get much done when the press has a negative outlook on them. And so in holding up this headline, Truman has a one-up over the media. But in this situation, why did this headline even get produced in the first place? Well, we can go back to the newspapers in the early era. There were no live vote totals. There were no counts around the internet or trending on Twitter. And so newspapers, recognizing that people had a demand for knowledge, they had to basically print two or multiple headlines depending on what certain races, like the presidential race for office, would be. Radio comes into play in the late 19th century. It's invented in the late 1800s, and this picture is notable because President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is seen here delivering his fireside chats to the American public. And this was a historic innovation. For the first time ever, Americans, whether they're listening on NBC or CBS or any other radio station, were able to gather around the fireplace, turn on their radio, and then for a few minutes to an hour, they could hear the words of the president. And he was very successful in advocating for many of his New Deal policies to help turn around the era of the Great Depression. We can see that the mode of communications changes the nature of politics. We can look at broadcast television emerge in the 1950s, and for a period of time there were only 3 national networks: ABC, NBC, CBS. And broadcast TV is going to change the way Americans engage in politics yet again. Take this classic clip in the debate between candidates Kennedy and Nixon. In this debate, it's historic for the idea, when people were watching the television on this debate, they were asked who won the debate. And television viewers thought Kennedy had won the debate, whereas radio listeners had thought Nixon was the clear victor. Maybe there's something to that. Television viewers said that Kennedy looked more energetic, looked up to the duties of the presidency, whereas Nixon, he was suffering from a cold, he sounded tired. But listeners on the radio said Nixon sounded more prepared, like he was more knowledgeable compared to Kennedy, who spoke in generalization rather than specific details. We see that if you were listening on TV, or if you were watching on TV or listening on radio, we can see that this can change our perception in mass numbers of who wins debates and other political outcomes. So let's touch on the broadcast media. Let's talk about regulations of it. The federal government regulates broadcast media. Now, it does not regulate things like books, the magazines, or the content published on the internet, with very few exceptions, such as crime and things of that nature. But by and large, if you have an idea, even if controversial, you can publish it in a book, magazine, or the internet. However, since broadcast TV and radio stations need an FCC license to operate, we can see that the demand for frequencies is high, and yet there is a low amount of TV and available radio signals. When we think about a radio station, you may listen to things like 101.1 or 105.9 or any other radio station in your local community. These radio stations need to pay the FCC every year for the rights to operate under that frequency. Could you imagine if the FCC wasn't there? It could be madness. You could see multiple broadcasters trying to play their message or their radio, their music, whatever shows they're airing, at the same time. This would lead to chaos and confusion amongst the masses. And so the FCC says we are going to ration whatever available broadcast signals there are to the different buyers. Buyers can bid on how much they want to pay for this license. And as a result, since the FCC license is so in demand, the FCC imposes certain regulations, such as placing prohibition on obscenity, indecency, and profanity. Take a show like HBO's Game of Thrones, in which there are depictions of obscenity and indecency and plenty of profanity. This show could not air on CBS unedited, could not air on Channel 7, ABC, or any other channel that is available over the airwaves, literally over the airwaves. And so if you were to find a show like that or anything that violates these rules, that station could be subject to a fine or even have their license revoked. So they will typically tape delay or edit shows down that are suitable, so it becomes suitable for viewership or listeners. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are other specific rules, such as the equal time rule, which have direct implications for our political discussion. Because whenever a broadcaster provides candidates for political office a chance to display their message, like an advertisement or a speech or an interview, Broadcasters must also offer equal opportunities to other candidates to communicate their messages. Take, for example, in 2016, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. If Donald Trump was a recipient of lots of airtime, then under the equal time rule, if Donald Trump pays for a lot of ads on a station, the broadcast station must also offer Hillary Clinton or any other candidate for office an equal chance to share their message. But notice this only applies to candidates. Other supporters and even political action committees and other interest groups, they can put their own ads and they are not subject to the equal time rule. Now, wherever you are getting your media from, one thing to note is that there have been many developments over a few decades. In 1983, for example, 90% of the American media was owned by 50 companies. But today, 90% of all media is controlled by just 6 media giants or conglomerates. Places like Comcast or News Corp. News Corp owns Fox. They used to own Fox Movie Studios, but they sold that to Disney. Disney owns ABC, ESPN, and Pixar. Viacom. Time Warner owns CNN, HBO, and the Time magazine. We can see that our information is in the hands of a select few, and this has raised some challenges for the public's trust in government because the public may feel that with so few chances for disagreement, maybe Americans are missing out on the bigger picture. Nonetheless, the reason these 6 media organizations own so much is because it has proven to be a cost-effective model. That these conglomerates can share resources such as studio time, airwaves, and more. And it's important to be critical, to think critically when reading an article on the internet or watching a news story on TV. But there are several ways in which the media can influence public opinion, and number one way is through agenda setting. Whenever the media reports on something, whatever they report on, that gives attention to that issue. The media has the power to identify issues that the politicians or the public will notice so that they can rally around and support or oppose specific items that politicians and government are working on. Another way the media can influence public opinion is through what's called selection bias. We have to recognize that the media are businesses and they tend to focus on only the most sensational stories. Why do they do it? They try to seek the largest audience possible. The higher your ratings are, the more you can charge advertisers to spend on taking out airtime. When there are many viewers or many listeners, you can raise your prices. And so how do you gain more viewers? Well, you're going to focus on things less frequently, like ideas of values. Candidates may often struggle to generate airtime. They may struggle to have their message heard. In exchange, they will place an emphasis on sensational stories. Take, for example, in 2016, little was discussed about the candidates' policy goals. However, the media did focus much of its discussion on the supposed scandals between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump alike. By focusing on these scandals and the horse race element of political coverage, we should go back to that idea of Madison talking about popular information. Is it good for the media to pick sensational stories over those boring, but perhaps more important stories? It's something to decipher, and it's something you should be aware of when consuming media. A third influence on public opinion is what's called framing. We recognize that stories are often complex and very nuanced. However, the media has the task of boiling down multiple sources of information into very palatable, smaller ways in which information can be compartmentalized and dissected in a relatively quick amount of time. Think of the millions of stories happening around the world, and how would you tell these stories? Well, chances are the media is going to use carefully chosen words and images, and politicians are wise to that. Politicians often speak in what are called sound bites, recognizing that the media may play only 5 to 10 seconds of their speech. They will try to load their speeches with inspirational one-liners or negative talking points about their opponents. Framing gives the media the power to shape the way we can digest certain ideas in politics. There's an article, there's a YouTube video I'm going to link in the second video of this chapter, but it's a CNN and Fox News hosts react to Trump's shithole remark. Now, yes, I am swearing on for this lesson, but this video is important because it shows the ways that different media organizations kind of spun the president's remarks. He had referred to, he had asked in a meeting how he can get people from richer countries, more European countries, as opposed to poorer people from, quote, shithole countries. And we're gonna see in this video how CNN and Fox News had very different ideas of how to present this, how to frame this story. I'll let you watch that right now, so click pause here and watch the other video. And we're back. So to review, which of the following news sources reaches most Americans? We had that chart that depicted radio, TV, the internet, and newspapers. We saw that television is the #1 source of news for most Americans. However, one thing to note about television, not a lot of information can be dissected in just a few minutes per story. And therefore, television is one of the least effective ways of providing information to the public, yet it is the most sought after news source. Take this question. Imagine this question could appear on your exam in some form. The power of the media to draw public attention to particular issues and problems is called framing, canvassing, agenda setting, or the bandwagon effect. We discussed how agenda setting is all about what the media reports. That whenever the media discusses anything of significance, it by its very nature becomes important because so many viewers will attune their eyes, give attention to this issue. So that's it for the media. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me. And of course, if there's a discussion board attached, ask and answer those questions. Take care, and I will see you soon, so to speak.